thought she had won the moment she hung up the phone. I could hear it in her voice, that little exhale, half satisfaction, half relief, like someone who just closed a deal they'd been nervous about. My son's wife, 34 years old, drives a white Porsche Cayenne, says things like going forward and circle back in every conversation. I'd watched her for 8 years, long enough to know exactly what kind of woman she was. What she didn't know was that I'd been ready for this phone call for 7 months. Let me back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I spent 36 years building something real. I started Callaway Freight. No, wait. I can't use that name. Let's just say I ran a regional logistics company out of Knoxville, Tennessee. Started with 2 trucks and a filing cabinet in a rented office the size of a bathroom. By the time I sold the majority stake in 2019, we had over 400 employees and contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. I didn't retire rich in the flashy sense. I retired comfortable. I had a house, not a mansion, but a house I built with my own hands alongside a contractor friend in 1987. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 11 acres of land in the foothills of the Smokies. My wife Elaine and I raised our son there. She passed in 2018, pancreatic cancer, 41 days from diagnosis to funeral. After Elaine died, I rattled around in that house like a marble in a shoebox. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he was to me. Whatever he became later, moved back to Knoxville in 2020 with his wife. They said they wanted to be closer to me. His wife had just left a marketing job in Atlanta, and my son was doing remote consulting work. They needed space to set up a home office, they said. I offered them the east wing of the house. 2 bedrooms, a separate bathroom, a large den that got good morning light. I put in a fiber internet line that cost me $800 to install. I did it gladly. I was lonely. I want to be honest about that. I was 68 years old, my wife was gone, and the sound of other people in the house felt like medicine. The first year was fine. The second year, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. My son started having conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. His wife began making comments, small ones, the kind you can't call out without sounding paranoid. Dad, you really should think about downsizing. This house is a lot to maintain at your age. Have you talked to a financial planner? You know the estate tax situation in Tennessee is complicated. She called me Dad, but said it the way someone says the name of a city they've never visited and have no interest in visiting. By the spring of 2023, they started talking about the property directly. My son sat me down one evening on the porch. I remember it was a Thursday because I'd had my weekly call with my old business partner that afternoon, and I was still in a good mood. My son told me he'd been talking to a developer, a man who wanted to build a boutique resort community in the foothills. The 11 acres, he said, were perfectly positioned. He used that phrase, perfectly positioned. And I recognized it immediately as something his wife had coached him to say. The developer was offering $2.3 million. I said I wasn't interested in selling. My son nodded slowly, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. He told me that selling would give me liquidity, that I could move into a nice senior community, not a nursing home, he was careful to say, a senior community, very different, and have money in the bank, peace of mind. His wife came out with 3 glasses of sweet tea like this was a pleasant family chat. She smiled at me over the rim of her glass and said, "We just want what's best for you." I thanked them for their concern and went inside. What I didn't tell them was that I'd already spoken to my attorney. Her name is Wanda, and she's been my lawyer since 1994. Sharp woman, grew up in Maryville, has a laugh like a screen door and a mind like a steel trap. 3 weeks before that porch conversation, I'd called Wanda because something had felt wrong for a while. A feeling in my chest I'd learned to trust after 3.5 decades in business. That feeling had kept me from signing a bad partnership agreement in 2003 and from hiring a CFO, who turned out to be embezzling from 2 other companies. I'd learned not to ignore it. Wanda and I spent 2 hours on the phone. Then we spent 4 more hours in her office 2 days later. What came out of those conversations was this. My son's wife had already made contact with the developer. Not my son, his wife. She had reached out independently, represented herself as acting on behalf of the property owner, and had been in discussions about a purchase timeline. She had also, I later learned, made inquiries about power of attorney. Quiet inquiries. The kind you make when you're testing the water temperature before you jump in. I didn't confront them. I want to be clear about that. I said nothing. Instead, Wanda and I got to work. The house and land were in my name alone. Elaine and I had set it up that way for estate planning reasons years ago. I contacted my financial advisor, a quiet man named Sid who has managed my account since I sold the business, and we restructured several things. The property was transferred into a revocable living trust. I updated my will. I amended the trust language with specific provisions that Wanda drafted over the course of about 3 weeks. Without going into details that would bore you, the effect was simple. No one could sell, transfer, encumber, or otherwise dispose of that property without my written consent, witnessed and notarized, with a mandatory 72-hour waiting period. Any attempt to do so without following that process would immediately trigger a reversion clause that would transfer the entire property to a land conservation nonprofit I'd supported for years. Wanda called it a steel door. I liked that. The paperwork was filed in February of 2024. Life continued. My son and his wife continued living in the East Wing. I continued being polite. His wife continued making her small comments. My son continued looking uncomfortable in the way that men look when they've made choices they're not proud of but aren't ready to undo. I went on with my life. Had coffee with my neighbor Bud most mornings, drove up to the national park 2 or 3 times a week, called my granddaughter in Colorado every Sunday. She's 14. Her name's not in that list of names I'm not supposed to use, but I'll just call her my granddaughter. She has her grandmother's eyes. In August, the phone call came. It was a Tuesday morning, just before 9. I was on the porch with coffee and the newspaper, actual paper. I still get the actual paper, when my cell rang. I didn't recognize the number. I answered. It was a woman from the developer's office, a transaction coordinator. She introduced herself professionally, apologized for calling directly, and asked if I could confirm some details related to the pending sale of the property at my address. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the porch railing. I said, "I'm sorry, the pending what?" She repeated it. "Pending sale. Closing scheduled for September 19th. She was calling to confirm my preferred wire transfer instructions for the proceeds. I asked her to hold for just 1 moment. I set the phone face down on my knee. I looked out at the tree line. Those same trees I'd watched from that porch for 37 years. The ridge my wife used to call our mountain. And I took 2 slow breaths. Then I picked the phone back up. I told her, calmly, that there was no pending sale, that I was the sole owner of the property, that no sale had been authorized by me in any form. I asked her to send me every document she had on file related to this transaction, to my email within the hour. She was flustered. I could hear it, and she said she'd have to check with her supervisor. I told her that was fine. I also told her that her company should stop all activity related to this transaction immediately, and that if the closing proceeded, she would want to make sure her company's legal team was familiar with the concept of fraudulent conveyance. I hung up. Then I called Wanda. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. There was a pause on her end. Not the pause of someone surprised, but the pause of someone shifting into gear. She said, "Okay, let me make some calls." I then walked through the house to the East Wing. I knocked on the door of the den that my son used as an office. He was on a video call. I waited. He ended the call and looked up, and whatever he saw on my face made him go a little pale. I said, "We need to talk." His wife appeared in the doorway behind him. I told them what had happened. I told them about the phone call. I told them about the developer's transaction coordinator and the closing date of September 19th. I watched their faces while I talked. My son looked at his wife. His wife looked at me, and for one brief moment, I've thought about this many times since. She looked not guilty, but calculating. Like she was deciding which version of the story to go with. She chose denial. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She said the developer must have gotten confused, that she'd had only preliminary conversations, that nothing had been authorized, that this was all a misunderstanding. She said it smoothly, quickly, like she'd considered this contingency. My son nodded along. He said, "Dad, there must be some kind of mix-up." I looked at my son for a long moment. He couldn't hold my eyes. I said, "I hope you're right." I said it quietly. Then I went back to the porch and finished my coffee. Over the following 10 days, Wanda worked. I won't bore you with the legal machinery. There's a lot of it, and most of it is tedious. But here is what emerged. My son's wife had signed a preliminary purchase and sale agreement with the developer using a notarized letter that purported to be a limited power of attorney, granting her authority to act on my behalf. The letter bore what appeared to be my signature. It was not my signature. Wanda confirmed this with a forensic document examiner. Not my signature, not my notary, not my seal. The notary stamp had been reproduced using a template. She'd found the same template sold on a legal forms website. Sloppy, honestly. But then, people who think they're smarter than everyone else often do sloppy work because they can't imagine getting caught. The developer, to their credit, cooperated fully once Wanda contacted their legal department. They had no idea the document was forged. They'd done a basic check and moved forward. They were, as it turned out, more embarrassed than anything else. On September 3rd, 16 days before the scheduled closing, Wanda filed a complaint with the Knox County District Attorney's Office. Forgery, fraud, identity theft. I also served formal notice to my son and his wife that they had 30 days to vacate the East Wing. I delivered that notice myself. I knocked on the den door again, and this time my son's wife answered. I handed her the envelope. She looked at it, then at me, and she started talking. Fast. The way people do when the air is going out of a balloon they can't patch. She said I was overreacting. She said this was a family matter, and I was turning it into something ugly. She said Elaine. She actually said my wife's name. My dead wife's name. Would be heartbroken to see me do this. That was the moment something settled in me. Completely still and cold and clear. I said, "Don't you say her name." I said it quietly. Then I went back to the porch. The next 4 weeks were not easy. I'm not going to pretend they were. My son came to me twice during that period. The first time, he was defensive. It was all his wife's idea. He didn't know the extent of it. He thought it was just exploratory. He never meant for it to go this far. I listened. I didn't yell. I asked him one question when the developer's transaction coordinator called to confirm wire transfer instructions. Whose bank account was she going to wire the money to? He didn't answer. The second time he came to me, he cried. He sat in the kitchen. The kitchen where I'd taught him to make his grandmother's biscuit recipe when he was 7 years old. And he cried and said he was sorry. I believe he was sorry. I believe he had allowed himself to be led somewhere he never should have followed. I believe he loved his wife more than he loved his integrity, and I believe that's a tragedy that belongs to him now. I told him I loved him. I told him that would not change. I also told him that love is not the same as consequence, and that consequence was no longer something I could protect him from. They left on October 1st. His wife never apologized. She left in the white Porsche Cayenne with 6 suitcases and a facial expression I can only describe as aggrieved, like I was the one who'd wronged her. The district attorney's office filed charges in November. Forgery of a legal instrument, fraud, and 1 count related to the identity theft statute. I'm not going to speculate on outcomes. The legal process is slow, and I've learned not to expect timelines. What I can tell you is that the developer withdrew from any further dealings with my son's wife entirely and submitted a formal statement supporting the DA's case. That winter was quiet. I won't romanticize it. Some nights were hard. I'd hear the house settle and think about Elaine, about my son as a boy, about all the years that had happened inside these walls. I think about the version of the future where none of this had occurred, where I'd grown old here with family nearby, with dinners on the porch in summer, with grandchildren running across the 11 acres. But then I'd think about the transaction coordinator's voice on the phone, the closing date of September 19th, the wire transfer instructions. And I'd think about Wanda saying, "Steel door," with that screen door laugh of hers. And I'd feel something that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough. Come February, I did something I'd been putting off for 6 years. I called a contractor and had the wraparound porch properly restored. New boards, new railings, the whole thing. Elaine had always wanted that done. I kept saying we'd get to it. I kept finding reasons to wait. I sat on that finished porch on a Sunday morning in March with my coffee and my newspaper. The trees were just beginning to show green. The ridge Elaine used to call our mountain was catching the early light, the way it does in spring. That particular gold that only lasts about 20 minutes before the sun climbs too high. My phone buzzed. My granddaughter in Colorado texting to say good morning. I typed back, "Good morning, sweetheart. Come visit soon." I put the phone in my shirt pocket and looked at those trees. The house was still mine. The 11 acres were still mine. Every board, every stone, every hill. Mine and Elaine's and nobody else's. She thought she had won the moment she hung up the phone. She never knew the door had already been locked. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. Mornings on that porch will do that to you. What I keep coming back to isn't the forgery, or the court filing, or even the look on my son's wife's face when I handed her that eviction notice. What I keep coming back to is a much quieter thing. The 7 months before any of it came to a head, when I was sitting on that same porch with the same coffee, watching the same ridge, feeling something was wrong, and choosing to listen to that feeling instead of explaining it away. That's the part nobody sees in a story like this. The part where nothing dramatic is happening, where you're just an old man with a bad feeling in a phone, and enough hard-won cents to call your lawyer before you need one. I spent 36 years in business. I made money, lost some, made more, built something that outlasted the bad years. And the single most important thing I ever learned, not from a book, not from a mentor, from getting burned and getting up, is that the people who end up on the wrong side of a situation are almost never the ones who were caught off guard. They're the ones who saw it coming and told themselves they were probably wrong. They didn't trust their own judgment. They wanted to believe the comfortable version. I almost did that. I want to be honest. When my son sat on that porch with his sweet tea and his rehearsed phrases, part of me wanted to believe he was right. That I was being suspicious of my own family. That the discomfort I felt was just the grief of a widower rattling around in a big house, misreading ordinary things as threats. It would have been easier to believe that. It would have been a lot more comfortable. But Elaine used to say, and she was right about most things, that comfort and wisdom are not the same direction. She said it about small things, garden variety things, but I found it true at every scale life has tested it. I think about my son. I think about him crying in that kitchen, and I believe his remorse was real. But remorse after the fact is a much cheaper thing than the courage it would have taken to say no when his wife was still planning. That's the part that costs something. That's where character actually lives. Not in the tearful aftermath, but in the quiet moment before you follow someone somewhere you know you shouldn't go. The willingness to disappoint the person you love most, when disappointing them is the right thing, is one of the hardest things a person can do. My son wasn't there yet. Maybe he'll get there. What I want anyone to take from this, if there's something worth taking, is simpler than people expect. Pay attention to what you've built. Know what belongs to you and protect it. Not out of greed, not out of suspicion, but because the work you put into something deserves to be honored. Document things. Have a Wanda in your life. Don't wait until the closing date is already set. And if someone uses your dead wife's name to manipulate you, if they reach into your grief like it's a tool they can borrow, that's the moment you stop second-guessing yourself entirely. I sat on that restored porch in March and felt something I can only describe as squared away, not healed. Some things don't heal. They just become part of the architecture. But squared away. The house was mine. The land was mine. The ridge was catching the light the way it always had. That's enough. After everything, that's enough.